Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I am a final year PhD student, and so I'm just going to be going over sort of my main conclusions from my thesis. And I was really interested in investigating how migrating centres influence the formation and the storage of really large volume rhyolites and silicic eruptions. So first of all, a sort of global perspective on where these occur. Large volume silicic bodies are typically associated with subduction arcs, and region extension is also one of the key factors. Thickened older crust, sort of perfect arc conversion rates, which is strongly associated with the magmatic flux, as well as the presence of any pre-existing structures such as fault zones. The final factor that really interested me was the presence or absence of arc migration, or whether or not the centre was on a young arc. These two factors have two main influences on magma generation at these centres. The first is that a previously unfluxed region that is being now fluxed may have unexploited bodies of quite easily fusible material that can be exploited. And over short timescales, arc migration can thermally and chemically mature a much wider region of the crust than an arc that's comparatively fixed in place. So when I was sort of looking for an arc where this might be quite nice to study, the Central American volcanic arc really popped out. Arc migration here has been ongoing since the Oligocene, and the arc front's very narrow, so we can really tightly constrain where arc migration has taken place and sort of over what timescales it has occurred. This arc also has numerous large silicic eruptions, so it's a great place to study them. And there are quite a few other structural factors. There's extension, there's thickening. In the central Guatemalan section, so right up in the northwest of the arc, there's quite a large amount of thickening, and this is where we find really, really large silicic eruptions. So this is where we focused and found our case study. So this is a zoom in on the central Guatemalan section. Here, trenchwood migration is ubiquitous at almost every centre that we see here. So this is present either as paired volcanic edifices, like Fuego is probably the most famous paired volcanic edifice in the world, but we also have the Tolima and Atitlán pair and the Santa Maria Santiaguito pair. This migration trend is also present in some lineaments, so there's chains of volcanoes that occur, such as the Zunil one. And finally, we see migration occurring where we have large silicic centres that are immediately to the north of the presently active arc front. What's also really fantastic about this centre is that we kind of have an understanding of the regional isotopic variation from the arc front. We know that as we get further from the trench, the crust will get more radiogenic, and that gives us really good sort of tool to understand what inputs are coming into the magmas that we see, whether they were sourced further from the arc front or right near the presently active arc front. And so this is Atitlán, for those of you that don't know, and this sort of leapt out again as the best case study. It's by far the largest, and it's also been quite well studied before, so it's a really good basis to launch. Multiple ignimbrites have been erupted from here over the last sort of 14 million years, and the most recent phase really famously produced the Los Jacoyos eruption 79,000 years. Thanks for the update. So quickly, I'm going to take you through the classification of the rocks that we see at this centre. This is quite a simplified stratigraphic diagram next to the task diagram. We start off with the phase 3 stratovolcanoes, both in the old and new positions of the arcs. There's 3 of them. These are then followed by the Los Jacoyos full deposit, which is a single compositional unit, which is high potassium rhyolites. This is then buried by the really voluminous flow deposits that we see that are classic at Los Jacoyos. These have a wide range of compositions. At least 3 different rhyolites were erupted in this unit. The high potassium also occurs in this one, and then we also see lower and medium potassium rhyolites here. Then we've got a series of post Los Jacoyos deposits as the cold air sort of settles. These are known as the D, F, and I tephras, and we won't really go into too much detail about them because we don't really have time, but they're also really fascinating deposits. And then finally, the resumption of stratovolcano activity occurs and we get the three stratovolcanoes, San Pedro, Atitlán, and Tolomán. Also, we analysed within this centre, we found an enclave magma. Unfortunately, it's kind of buried by another point, but this is an enclave magma that we found in one of the post-Lostricoid pumices. And finally, this big pink field represents a really key group of analyses of what I call very high potassium melts, because they have a lot of potassium in them. And these are found in the stratovolcano lavas, and also within some lithics as sort of interstitial melts. And these play a really key part in the evolution of the centre. So I'm going to initially focus on what that means for the andesites. This is a plot of, and this is as simple as my plots get, no ratios, so don't have to worry about that. But this is potassium versus rubidium, and these are sort of the key elements that show differences between the enclave andesite that we found and the stratovolcano lavas. And so the stratovolcano lavas really shoot off to high potassium contents and high rubidium contents, whereas the enclave magma is much less enriched. If we then extend this plot to include the very high potassium melts that I mentioned, as I said, they're very high in potassium, typically around 7 weight%, and they're also coupled with rubidium and other large iron lithophile element enrichments. In other trace elements, we also see some key differences between these two different andesites. So the stratovolcano lavas have a trend of really increasing europium anomalies and strontium anomalies. These are two traces that are quite keyly indicative of plagioclase fractionation. Europium also has some other effects with phases like amphibole and apatite, but this is sort of the key takeaways, that we see strong anomalies develop within the stratovolcano lavas, but much weaker ones in the enclave. And these suggest that they have very different petrogenesis. So with those observations, we decided to do a little bit of modelling using the EME AFC model of Burton Johnson et al. And the top plot shows the model results for the stratovolcano lavas, whereas the bottom plot is the enclave. And we were able to quite successfully reproduce the compositions that we see. So for the stratovolcano lavas, a combination of assimilation and fractional crystallization could produce them, where we used the high potassium melts as the assimilant, whereas pure fractional crystallization can produce the enclave magma. And this fractional crystallization also includes slightly more higher amounts of amphibole and slightly less amounts of plagioclase. And this mineral assemblage can also recreate the europium anomaly, or lack of europium anomaly, that we observe. Quickly, where do these melts come from? Well, for those of you who know much about sort of where melts come from, immediately think high potassium, high large iron lithophiles, biotite melts are kind of the obvious culprit. And we do see some really obvious examples of these melts and melt generations. This is a photo micrograph of an antilith, so a lithic that we found in the rock that's that appears quite related to the lava that it was hosted in. And we see regions of pyroxenes and biotites that look really unhappy and are surrounded by melts and amphiboles. And so we think a melt reaction of pyroxene and biotite has occurred that produces secondary amphibole and then these very high potassium melts. So this is a sort of conceptual model of what we think was going on about 100,000 years ago. We have the migration has occurred, and it's fluxed a really wide region of the crust with magmas, and we have the hybridization of the basaltic andesites at the base of the crust. These migrate to the mid crust, where we think a minor amount of amphibole fractionation occurs before they reach the upper crust, where the real sort of production occurs, where they mix with these melts and form the stratovolcano magmas that we see at the surface. With that in mind, we can move on to how the Lostricoios rhyolites came about. And so I've included the pumices on the plot, as well as the stratovolcano lavas in the enclave. And we see at least three rhyolites. These are the biotite-bearing high potassium rhyolites, and then a biotite and cummingtonite-bearing intermediate potassium rhyolite, and finally the low potassium rhyolite, which has both high calcium and cummingtonite amphiboles. Some of the key trace element plots again. if we look at the rubidium as sort of a proxy for just general large iron lithophile content, we see really strong large iron lithophile enrichments in the lost turquoise and the high potassium lost turquoise pumice, and much less enriched signatures for the lower potassium rhyolites, similar to the different trends that we see with the stratovolcano lavas, and the enclave magma is also pointing towards this less large iron lithophile enriched trend. With the europium and strontium anomaly plot, again, we see this sort of hint of a trend with the enclave magma and the lower potassium lost turquoise rhyolites, and then the really strong europium and strontium anomalies that we see in the high potassium rhyolites. So again, we thought we'd take those observations and do a little modeling, and if we sort of apply a crystal melt fractionation model to the remnants of the stratovolcano lavas, we can really nicely form the high potassium rhyolite composition. Fractional crystallization of the enclave is slightly more difficult to nail down the compositions, but it's sort of the best fit that we have. This might be because we don't really have great constraints on what the range of compositions we see at recharged magmas. Unfortunately, we only were able to recover the one enclave of analyzable size or non-disaggregation. So it may well be that some of the recharged magmas had less potassium in them, which there may be some evidence for, but I don't really have time to get into all that. The final piece of the puzzle comes from the isotopes. The plot on the left shows strontium isotopes against silicon, and what really jumps out is that there is no relationship between increasing silicon and strontium isotope composition. It really appears that they're completely decoupled. Instead, if we look on the plot on the right, with the different phases, we see that the older, further from the trench phases are much more radiogenic than the younger present arc front locations. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, we know that the crust in this region is more radiogenic further from the trench and less radiogenic at the sort of present arc front. And so we think that the lavas obtained their signature, their isotopic signature, during their initial formation. They kept it with them as they evolved. And then what we also see that's really interesting is the lost turquoise magmas all plot sort of right slap bang in the middle of the trend. And I think this is quite good evidence that we've got some homogenization of the different inputs. If we then look at what this looks like in a conceptual model, again, we've sort of updated it for what we think the magma system looked like shortly before eruption. We've got a really large body of magmas that encompasses the entire width of the center. And so we're getting inputs from the further part of the arc, from the trench, and the nearer part of the arc. And these are providing a wide range of isotopes signals that then get homogenized in this really large body. And these are extracted from the lower crust. These are extracted from the stratovolcano mush. And then below them, we have the lower potassium rhyolites. These don't have any large iron lithophile enrichment, really. And so we think they're quite separate from the upper crust. And they're instead fueled by magmas that were sourced in the mid crust and had a sort of more dominant amphibole presence in their fractionating phases. So that's kind of a quick take through of what my project has been like. We think that migration can explain the size and the geochemistry of the lost turquoise rhyolites, and that these different magmas derived from earlier shallow stratovolcano magmatism and from deeper recharged magmas, respectively. And I think this sort of shows that investigation of geochemical variations at migrating centers can really constrain migration's control on magma generation and storage. And this is a real key piece of the puzzle for the generation of large volumes of silicic magmas.